Hello, my name is Rosanna Fanni, and today I will talk about my research as part of my Erasmus Mundus master degree in digital communication leadership between the VUB in Brussels and the University in Salzburg. And I'm really happy to speak about my research today at the UCLA IS Lab presentations, recorded obviously, because I have been lucky enough to study at the UCLA for the last quarter, so the spring quarter, as a visiting graduate researcher at the UCLA at the GSE and IS lab under the supervision of Professor Leah Leafru. And today I'm going to present my research about my master thesis, which deals with the policy question about AI and in detail how AI is being understood as ethical or non-ethical in the European Union. And essentially what I will do today is just very briefly speak about the background, so why am I interested in this topic, why is it important. Then I will just briefly review some of the concepts that I've been using, and also speak briefly about my methodology. And then as a last step, I just want to share with you my preliminary findings, which I'm writing up at the moment for a research paper, which has been accepted at the IAMCR conference this summer. So in July, I'm going to present this paper there. And therefore, I'll mostly speak about the research results that I've been writing up for this paper so far. Exactly. So let's get started with the first part. Basically, I want to just briefly introduce you why this research is important and why I've been interested in this topic. So my background is in communication and political science. In Brussels, there's a lot of discussion going on about AI and AI governance, and particularly why the EU now has to act in the sense of establishing policies and legal framework for AI systems. And I've been noticing that as soon as I was in Brussels, which is since last year, February. What I've been noticing already at the very beginning is that like a lot of policy documents have already been released, both by the European Commission and by its member states. But they were speaking about AI as a very scattered concept. So some documents were mentioning AI as the machines will take over the world, and others were speaking about rather industry applications of AI, so for example robots, and other documents again were speaking about something else. So I already noticed it's interesting how these documents frame AI and how they understand AI and what they define as AI and what they do not define as AI. So I think this was already a really important learning outcome that I've pursued a little bit more in the research project of from the university, where we mapped AI definitions. But I thought this could not maybe be the end of my research for my thesis. So I investigated a little bit more of these documents, and I actually found very interesting definitions around what would be accepted, what would be not accepted, or how basically AI is conceptualized as a good thing or a bad thing in general. And I've also been noticing that not only at the time European governments, so basically in Germany, in France, in Spain, they had all different national legislation about AI coming up. But then also the European Commission had an initial policy document about AI, but this was not a legislation. And then also other documents emerged. So for example, from the OECD, from Japan, from the US, then later in the course, and also research documents about AI were established. And they all highlighted very different principles. More or less the principles are very, very closely related to each other, but the documents were really also highlighting different things when it came about AI and what would be acceptable and what would be not acceptable. So I already noticed that there were different understandings of what is accepted when it comes to AI and what is rather not accepted, but this also again differed between countries. And so I again looked at the European Union documents, and I noticed that the concept of ethical AI was really very present, and it was being used a lot. But what I didn't find was the concept of unethical AI. And this is actually how my title came together. So basically my master thesis is named The Normative Policy Framework of Unethical Artificial Intelligence in the European Union. And the unethical is explicitly in brackets because I was missing a little bit this unethical delineation, and this is actually the whole point about my thesis. But yeah, this is just as a little background as like why I thought this topic is interesting and how it came together. Maybe it also is worth mentioning that in Brussels there's a big discussion about basically the delineation of or the policymaking sphere of AI, because when the European Commission noticed it was 2017, 2018 that AI would be a really important topic and that they would want to initiate legislation on that, they established a high-level expert group on AI, which is supposedly independent, but as we all know, this concept is very broad, let's say. And in this group are 52 members, and there are only a few scholars, and only one scholar, which is actually from the background of philosophy and ethics. And it's rather surprising to me that many industry stakeholders are in this group, but not so many people who actually can define and really well outline what is ethical and what is not ethical. So this was also one of the reasons that why I wanted to study this group in more detail. Exactly. So coming to the literature, I just wanted to highlight basically one finding in my literature review, that because obviously I was then looking around which literature exists on the concept of ethical and unethical AI. And it was interesting to see that the increase of this term ethical AI in the literature itself, so I only did a brief overview of the keyword ethical AI and the documents that came up on Google Scholar. And if you really have a look at it, the increase is like this. It's really exponential. So you see that in 2004 there was one article, 2005 two, and then it increased, and in 2019 I think there were about 200 documents already only on the term of ethical AI. So that I think was a really interesting observation in my literature review. Exactly. So turning to my plan and my methods, I very briefly, I was just in Brussels at the time, and I took advantage of that basically and conducted my expert interviews based on the readings that I've done and the literature review that I've already started, but not, let's say, in a very structured way. So I had an understanding of the topic, and this was why my research and my expert interviews were rather exploratory than explanatory, because I wanted to find out actually what is the understanding of the European Union's stakeholders in Brussels when it comes to the term unethical AI. And this was very interesting. I did 15 expert interviews, and I also took into consideration to not only interview officials, but I also did interview with industry stakeholders and also with philosophers. When I came to UCLA, basically in March, I started analyzing a case study on ethical AI and unethical AI, which is about biometric AI technology. So it's about facial recognition basically. And the preliminary findings, basically I wrote up for a paper which I'm going to present at the IAMCR conference, and which I will speak about now. So Essentially, this paper was already submitted in March, but I didn't yet have the results, so it was a little bit struggling for me, or I was a little bit struggling to write up the summary, but not yet have all results ready. Basically, I analyzed or compared two policy documents. One is the advisory group on ethics and new technology, which is the EGE. And the second group that I'm going to compare this document to is the European high-level expert group on AI, which I already mentioned in the beginning, this group that was rather contested when it comes to AI and the policy approach. And I basically analyzed these two documents based on their framing of how they understand ethical and unethical AI. And explicitly, as I already mentioned, I focused on the definition of unethical AI because I think that's the most interesting part when it comes to regulation, because regulation normally should also support, let's say, delineate what is unaccepted or what is not accepted, so that legislation can be developed and put in place to avoid certain situations or outcomes. What I find interesting when reading these documents already was that they used the term unethical AI as such in a very different way. So that means the European high-level expert group on AI, the AI HILEG, I will abbreviate it, they did not mention the term unethical AI, not even once. In contrast, the European Group on Science and Ethics and Technology, the EGE group, they mentioned this term once. And obviously it's not only about this term, but you already see in the way that the EGE uses this term that they have a more clear understanding of what they actually would recommend as like policy advice when it comes to unethical AI, or the sort of AI that we would like to avoid. And basically their context is that they say such unautonomous management of human beings would be unethical, and it would undermine the deeply entrenched European core values. Human beings ought to be able to determine which values are served by technology. This cannot be left to machines, no matter how powerful they are. So you already see that they have a very clear understanding of what they would like to avoid when it comes to AI, namely that humans are being automatically processed, or that their data is processed. And I find that very interesting because I searched for a similar passage in the other document from the European high-level expert group on AI, but I was not able really to find such a passage, and this already I think is an interesting finding. In contrast, what they say about unethical AI, they have one section where they discuss for specific examples. So the examples are identifying and tracking individuals with AI, then an AI-enabled citizen scoring in violation of fundamental rights, then human beings, lethal autonomous weapon system, and another theme which is about safety. And this is very interesting because they rather refer to practical examples, which is fine as well, I think. But in comparison with the EGE, it becomes clear that the European high-level expert group on AI places much more responsibility on practitioners, and thereby, I would say, clearly does not foster or encourage the European legislator or the European Commission, which is the entity in the European Union that initiates the legislation, that the recommendation basically of this group is not to initiate any legislation, but to, let's say, place the responsibility on industry. Just to say that I identified 3 themes: the theme of democracy, the theme of humans, and the theme of safety. And for the theme of humans, we can see that the European High-Level Expert Group delineates the definition or defines the responsibility of AI practitioners as one to basically ensure that humans are made aware of or are able to request and validate the fact that they interact with an AI system. Whereas the EGE clearly says that there have to be legal limits. So I think this is already an interesting finding. Yeah, so this is just a little excerpt from my IAMCR paper. I'm finalizing this paper right now, and I will submit it probably in the beginning of June. Yeah, June. And basically, as a final finding that I think is just interesting to further look at this issue. Also based on my background in political science, is this concept of normative power Europe. Of normative power Europe, which is concept in political science that says EU legislation is basically having some global effects because some countries or some legislation is based on European legislation because it's kind of a norm setter in the international legislation sphere. And I think this is at best seen maybe with the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which has been widely adopted in also other countries based on the European example, let's say. And I think it's very interesting to follow the legislation process on AI and see in the end what the European Union defines as ethical AI, what it defines as unethical AI, and also subsequently which countries maybe go and adopt similar legislation, which is based on the European example. Exactly. If you would want to follow up with me, just feel free to contact me at any time. I'm going to be back in July, so I will contact you as soon as I'm back. And I hope that this was interesting enough to give you a little insight into our research or my research in detail. And I look forward to hearing from you, and thank you so much for your attention.